What scene comes to your mind when I say the phrase, out of order? Maybe it's the sign on an unreliable vending machine, or maybe it's the slamming of the gavel as a judge tries to bring order back to his courtroom. Maybe it's that time in kindergarten where your nemesis cut in line again. I'm not bitter about that. The scriptures begin with this ancient story of God setting creation in its place. And of course, we know the result of that is very, very good. But we also know it's not very long before this serpent enters the garden. This serpent that is out of place, doesn't seem to quite belong, and he quickly helps get things out of order. We know the story of how sin has scattered order, and that the history of humanity has basically been us scrambling to reassemble all of the pieces. And so since the story of the fall, we're left asking, which part do I play in helping reorder God's good, very good creation? Am I a friend, or am I an enemy of order? And if I'm a friend, is it God's order, or is it something else? So today you get to ask this question from the comfort of your living room. But the characters in our story in Exodus 14 are not quite so fortunate. So we pick up with Israel having been liberated. They are set free, and the joy must have been immense as they march out of Egypt, victors with all of the spoils. Egypt is all too happy to see them go after everything that they've been through. But what follows is some wandering, and Israel appears lost to themselves and to the Egyptians, and they're camped by this sea, the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, as some Bibles read. And so we get to ask ourselves, as Israel has gone from joy and just the best feelings in the world to feeling terrified as 600 of Egypt's elite chariots and all the other chariots in the land are closing in and they are pinned against the water. Where do we find ourselves in this story? So I encourage you to read all of Exodus chapter 14 as we're going to talk about that story today. Perhaps it's most natural that we identify with the Hebrews. We have been set free from sin if we're followers of Jesus, and so there's a lot of parallel to find there. Plus, we love a good underdog story, don't we? But the Israelites are seeking the status quo in this story, what's more orderly than that, right? But it's not exactly the order that God has in mind. And having seen the high price of God's ideal order, the Israelites are saying things like this. Moses, weren't there enough graves in Egypt? Why did we have to come out here to the desert to die? Or then they go on to say, just let us be slaves. Real heroic lines like that. We don't think we're much like the Hebrew slaves in that regard, perhaps, but we are like this every time we are too in love with the way things are to imagine what could be, God's preferred future. This happens every time we have a failure of nerve and we don't stand up for ourselves or for someone else who needs it. This happens every time we live in denial of our destructive behaviors and faults, and we say it's fine, or this will be the very last time. We find ourselves in these shoes when we are the person so lacking in self-worth that we drift from one abusive relationship to the next, just a perennial victim, and somewhat happy to be that. So surely not. We're not like the Hebrews in this story. Maybe we're more like the Egyptians, but I hope not. The Egyptians represent another type of wrong order. This order is at others' expense. It's a top-down power structure order. And perhaps unknowingly, but very persistently in this story, they are aligned with the forces of destruction. They have been decimated by plagues, 1, 2, 3, and the numbers mount. And they are agents of chaos, but they can't quite get smart. They live by the sword, and as we find out by the end of this story, they will die by the sword. They are swamped by the culmination of their violent activity. We might empathize with them for just a moment. I mean, who wouldn't just wildly swing at any being that might dare to take our firstborn from us? Still, we have to consider the lack of empathy that has led them to this moment. Some of us are born naturally empathetic. We see others' pain and we feel it very strongly within ourselves. We don't have a hard time imagining what it might be like to walk in someone else's shoes. Still, others of us learn empathy through experience in life. We face a hard situation. We learn what it's like to go hungry, and the next time we see someone who's hungry, we say, I know what that's like, and we feel for and with them. But the Egyptians haven't shown any sign of empathy in this story. They intend to console their great grief with more vengeance. And so they will drown in a sea of their own stubborn violence. They are those that have sown the wind and reaped the whirlwind that is holding these seas apart later on. There's this heartbreaking poetic justice in this, and that they are washed over in the waters of the Red Sea, just like their young victims years earlier, those Hebrew boys who were tossed into the Nile. We are agents of chaos each and every time that the good that is good for me comes at the expense of someone else. Dan Rodriguez, who was a missionary to Mexico for years and years, talked about the Hispanic view of the United States and how, as an American citizen, we might imagine that the United States, for these Mexicans that come and try to make a living here, is like the promised land. And he said, well, when I talked to those that I was working with, it wasn't like that at all. The United States wasn't so much the promised land as it was Egypt. And you don't have to embrace that worldview to appreciate the struggle of people who see our country in that light. How can I be a person who helps to lift up and empathize with those that I meet each and every day? And so maybe we're not like the Hebrews, and I hope we're not like the Egyptians. I think more likely we're something like Moses in this story, where we are caught in between two worlds. Quite literally, in this story, Moses is standing in the middle where God places him. He is born a Hebrew, but he has learned to walk and talk like an Egyptian. And he's not quite sure at this point if he fits in either of these worlds, or if he's the man to do the job that God has called him to. For Moses, I really like the ancient symbol, Chinese symbol of the Yin-Yang. I think it represents him really well. It's this circle, and it's got a curved line that divides these two black and white sides. And in each of the black and white sides, you have a white circle in the black side and a black circle in the white side. And then there's that invisible line drawn down the middle. And this is that narrow road. This is that pressure-packed space where Moses finds himself in this story, where he's called to confront the darkness in the world and in himself. And we ask, will he overcome? It's the decision that we make each and every day to be a friend or an enemy of God's good order. Moses is in the middle, the man who can't give a speech to save his life, but he seems to be finding his voice to save others. And so Moses in this story, as the people are trapped against the sea and the Egyptians are bearing down, he doesn't exactly know what to do. And he shouts out in chapter 14, stand still, stand your ground, watch and see what the Lord will do. He will fight for you today. Which is really funny because just within the next verse or so, God responds and says, actually tell them to get moving. They need to not stand still at all. They need to start walking into the sea. Everyone go, except for you, Moses. You stand still. Like Moses, we are far from perfect. Moses, this man of God who has killed another man and been called a bridegroom of bloodshed by his wife in one of the strangest stories in Exodus, or maybe all the Bible. That one will not be in our sermon series, but you can read about it. Moses stands with his arms outstretched over the waters, a plea for peace, a plea for order, a plea for a new way to walk in, for freedom. There's that old spiritual that says, go down, Moses, way down to Egypt, and tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. And while the names have changed, the story still remains basically that same refrain. There's this battle between chaos and order, oppression and freedom, and we get to choose which side we will fight for. And so God, the great I am, this constant creator, steps into this Red Sea episode and he recalls the creation story from Genesis, where the waters that equaled chaos, and in the ancient worldview, this is where evil and the unknown dwelled. God speaks order into that chaos. The Spirit hovers over the waters, and the wind in our story blows and divides things into their proper, healthy boundaries and places. Life can flourish in the dry ground. God guides his people on this fragile and tenuous path. Creating dry ground in the desert maybe doesn't sound that impressive until it cuts straight through the only lake in sight. And so with Egypt behind a welcome and willing gravesite for the Egyptians, and the waters of chaos standing very tenuously on either side, God beckons, come forward, walk this narrow path with me. Life is calling. Jesus has walked this desert road. He has walked this road to Calvary. He has confronted the sins of the world, and he has come out on top. And he asks us to follow. Egypt, Israel, Moses, they all had to make their choice, and so must we.